Thank you, and a warm welcome to all of you here today, and thank you, Callista, for inviting me to have the floor here for a bit. And congratulations to RISC-V International, 4,000 members, over 14,000 people involved, and from 70 countries around the world. It's an amazing feat, and I have no doubt that this organization will continue to grow. I've been asked to speak a little bit about some of the policy developments beginning with the CHIPS Act in the United States. During my tenure at the Department of Commerce, I was certainly involved in the formation of the CHIPS Act and other policy here in the U.S. I've also been asked to look at it from a global dynamic and explore other competitive innovation policies that others are pursuing. And lastly, what are the implications for the group here gathered today? So I'll spend a little bit of time on that. So just a reflection on the CHIPS Act itself in the U.S. It was enacted into law almost 3 years ago. The passage coincided with the Competes Act, which eventually led to the president signing the appropriations into law in July of last year. Coincidentally, since the time of its signing, we've seen no dollars flow out the door yet to any company, yet there has been well over $60 billion worth of announcements from the IDM and foundries in the U.S. So let's say that there are a lot of people hoping those dollars flow out the door sooner rather than later. I'll break down the CHIPS Act a little bit for those of you in the room and then explore with you how you might consider participating in it. So there is 3 primary components that I'll dive down into a bit further. The CHIPS for America Fund essentially is that $52.7 billion that you hear referenced. And that is broken down further into direct incentives to companies and support for R&D ecosystems throughout the U.S. You also have this Advanced Manufacturing Investment Tax Credit, which is essentially a 25% refundable credit to those that are expanding capacity in the U.S. As well as equipment suppliers. The last is this Public Wireless Supply Chain Information Innovation Fund, which essentially will deploy technology that will enhance the 5G supply chains. I will spend less time on that one. So breaking down this fund, this $52 billion, the biggest portion of this is the $39 billion that the Department of Commerce will implement. Again, this is direct financial incentives to companies and groups of companies that are expanding their presence in the United States, especially in fabrication, assembly, test, advanced packaging, and/or R&D. The $11 billion is to set up these R&D consortia. I mean, one of the famous ones in the industry back in the early days when I was involved directly in the industry and got my start was Sematech, right? So this is really Sematech on steroids. It takes into account some of the best practices that the Semiconductor Research Corporation established and really forms some new world-class programs to advance the technology here in the U.S. alongside industry partners. The other fund here that I'll dive down into is the CHIPS for America Defense Fund. Essentially, the Department of Defense got $2 billion to set up hubs across the country, known now as the Microelectronics Commons Program. I'll talk a little bit about that. And then the workforce component. So many of you, particularly those that are trying to attract talent into your industry, this is a major issue, keeping a lot of people up at night. So how can we augment those attraction efforts through NSF? So again, we see the notice of funding opportunities for those IDMs and foundries, both on the leading edge and feature-rich nodes, as I refer to them as. I never say mature or legacy. I mean, that is not really a marketing, thing that's well received. So those feature-rich companies will also be applying. There's a $3 billion cap per project. Importantly, it's not per company. nor per state. It's really per project. So companies will be able to submit competitive applications. And for those of you thinking, well, gosh, I'm not expanding, foundry capacity or involved in, assembly, packaging, and test, or in the equipment business, how do I, directly benefit from some of these incentives? Really, the Commerce Department is looking for applications that involve the entire supply chain. So, for instance, one example would be, an EDA company partnering with a fabless company that is also engaging with a foundry and talking about, reshoring a particular product line of strategic importance that will enhance supply chain resiliency. That is a competitive application, and as opposed to a standalone, incentive. So that might get the wheels turning a bit as to, who are some of your customers that you might want to have a conversation about. I can guarantee you those that are on the front lines are looking for those types of partnerships. So, gosh, the program has been very popular. Again, they have been, a bit tardy in getting funds out as they review the applications, have stood up the process as well as the structure internally at the Commerce Department. I will tell you that in the federal government, it's very hard to bring in people quick. When I was involved, they asked if I wanted special hiring authority. I didn't know what that meant, but I wanted it. Now they have 160 people there that have stood up this program. They have received over 600 statements of interest, which is the first step for anyone that wants to be involved. It's a fairly straightforward process that really gets your name in the hopper. They've received over 120 pre-applications, which is quite a novel thing in and of itself. The government essentially encouraged folks to submit a pre-application, and they would give you feedback on how you could strengthen before you went to the full application phase. And that feedback is quite substantive. Nothing is binding, by the way, in that statement of interest. So companies that are looking to explore that, you can change things along the way. So how are these split up? So I mentioned the commercial leading edge, the feature-rich nodes. Then we have the supplier community. So that notice of funding opportunity was separate. They split that into two buckets, those with projects over $300 million and those under $300 million. There's a slightly different process depending on your capital expenditures. That was released back in June for projects under $300 million. Again, all of this is publicly available on chips.gov. It's a very substantive website, and you can learn a little bit more about it. The one that they have not yet got out the door that will be, I think, of tremendous interest to some of you in this room will be the R&D facility notice of funding opportunity, which will augment capital expenditures and facilities that are pursuing R&D, particularly in partnership with others in that ecosystem. So that one is scheduled to come out here later in late fall. They no longer give dates, by the way, in the federal government. They apply seasons to their deadlines, so fall is later for some than others, but I would encourage you to look at that. So now we flip to the $11.7 billion. So we have the National Semiconductor Technology Center that their board of trustees were recently announced. I'll share them here momentarily. And you have the National Advanced Packaging Manufacturing Program. These are the first year appropriations that will be devoted to those programs. There's an interlap between these two programs. They won't obviously work independent of one another. But essentially, there was a perceived notion that, gosh, even if you had 100% of fabrication capacity here in the U.S., if you did not attract packaging capability, particularly on the advanced packaging front, you would still have some major supply chain issues. So there is a great effort to stand up packaging capability. We'll be hearing some announcements about that, including a white paper that NIST will be releasing here in the coming weeks. Today they're actually meeting in Washington and will be announcing some of this later today. So the NSTC, again, to support and extend U.S. leadership in semiconductor research, design, engineering, and advanced manufacturing. All of these programs are open to anyone expanding in the U.S., both foreign and domestic. There was a great deal of intent on that, recognizing that we wanted to welcome companies from all over the world. NSTC, a lot of familiar names on here. These are the folks, many of whom retired from their their companies. You see, Craig, for instance, who was on our board for many years at SIA. Craig retired as the CEO of Intel. You have Jim Plummer there from Stanford, who many of you have interacted with. These folks will be tasked with setting up the infrastructure for that $5 billion NSTC program. They'll also be selecting a CEO, and then ultimately they will be looking for feedback on projects that entity will fund, along with shared infrastructure that they will be standing up around the country that people can tap into. So again, you will have the board, which has been established. You'll have a CEO, and these are some of the areas, including architecture, design, and tools, which you see there alongside 6 other areas. Again, it's not too late to get involved in any of this. They're just standing it up, so you haven't missed much over the last 6 months if you have not yet got involved. But I would encourage you to start looking at some of this activity and figuring out how could RISC-V play a key role here. So you have 2 other programs on a smaller scale. I mean, it's somewhat ironic that we talk about a $500 million program as a smaller program, but these are 2 other programs that have been stood up. The Manufacturing USA programs have a rich history in the U.S., ranging from composites to photonics, to power electronics. There's a good deal of understanding of how they've set these up with the industry and the university community. They'll be rolling this out. They'll probably select about 3 institutes around the country here. Metrology, this is really internal to NIST. NIST, as you know, if you can't measure it, you can't make it. NIST saw the train running, candidly, on a $52 billion program, and they used this opportunity to enhance some of their metrology capabilities and infrastructure at NIST, at the labs, for instance, in Boulder. Program timeline, so again, we're right now in the fall of 2023. The NSTC will be established. The NAPMP white paper on the packaging front will be coming out. They'll be soliciting comments from you on that front. And then you have the 2 other programs that are under development. You have the workforce efforts. So again, this is really driven by the National Science Foundation. For those of you in the university community here, I'd encourage you to play an active role in helping shape that program, particularly along the lines of developing additional talent on the RISC-V front and standards development writ large. I will dive into the Defense Fund here on this next slide. So again, this is now the Microelectronics Commons. You see, just last month, the DoD announced the initial awards for 8 hubs across the country, some of whom you probably are already partnering with. I see, Sci-Fi in the room, Tom Leahy and Jack. If you don't know what this is, talk to them, because I think I've seen them at least 90% of these hub activities, and they've done a great job in introducing RISC-V to these hubs and playing a central role in them. On the next meeting will occur here in the November timeframe, and each of these hubs will have independent groups that are helping implement them. Again, I'm going to skip past the Security and Innovation Fund. That's primarily focused on 5G and building up some international collaboration. You can see more about that on chips.gov, as well as the Public Wireless Supply Chain Fund, as I want to have sufficient time to discuss a few other things here. Again, the tax credits available for those of you who have not looked into it, 25% credit. On the guardrail provisions, so there are guardrail provisions associated with participation in terms of what one can and can't do in foreign countries of concern. So that is something to pay close attention to, and it basically limits the ability for recipients of CHIPS funds to expand capacity, particularly on leading edge nodes outside of the U.S., and restricts participation in some cases. Before I go into CHIPS Goes Global, I mean, many of you have heard about states also participating. There's actually a prerequisite requirement for anyone that's looking for CHIPS funding to first gain some support from a U.S. state. That's really the first step to engage with where you're currently headquartered or where you're looking to expand with a state economic development organization who will then provide you some type of support that can be utilized in your application. I will say that there's more than a dozen states that have announced programs over $500 million each that will complement the CHIPS federal funding that one can strive to compete for. On the CHIPS Goes Global, shortly after the U.S. announced their CHIPS Act, when I was there, we had Japan announce their version of their CHIPS Act. The EU has announced a CHIPS Act. The UK has announced a CHIPS Act. So there's a lot of international activity here going on. And for those of you who are participating from these various regions, I'd encourage you to take a look at this and ensure that you are able to help shape some of these programs internationally to ensure that they're focused on our industry here today. In essence, as I reflect on this conference, it's been terrific for me. I've learned so much as well. I'd like to, just in my view, what RISC-V has, the impact that RISC-V has made on compute architecture can be characterized as significant as the transition from vacuum tubes to transistors. I mean, that statement, is my personal view. But I will say that, and for those of you who have an affection or living in a vacuum tube, I apologize, but I'll tell you that you really have done something here in a short amount of time that will fundamentally impact the growth of this industry. And you know that, but I think it's important for us to tell that to policymakers globally, particularly as there's somewhat of a lack of understanding as to the benefits that you have made to compute architecture in some circles. So I'd encourage you to get out there and educate. I would also say that there are strategic partnerships that can yield benefits and advance RISC-V. One such example is Microchip and SiFive and JPL. Advancing the high-performance space computing efforts on RISC-V platforms. Great example there. And again, that's an example that we want to share broadly. I think the other thing I would say that, as we look at just standards-making bodies globally, my capacity as a former assistant secretary and then having spent time, more than 10 years in this industry, regulations on open standards, really make little sense to me. And I mean, we could see the consequences or envision them if that had been the case for USB protocols or Ethernet protocols. I mean, imagine, what would have taken place there. We also witnessed the impact, quite frankly, from the lackluster participation in 5G standards making bodies by some regions. So that is definitely something that we don't want to repeat, and therefore I'd encourage full participation by everyone that can provide value add here in this body. There's a clear differentiation between open standards and open source, and officials must recognize that existing regulatory controls do a pretty sufficient job of capturing end products as they flow through the global marketplace. So I'd encourage past colleagues to look into what are we actually trying to solve, and also take into account the industry's feedback as they're looking into it. I often reflect on a committee hearing. This is before my time in the industry, but it was in actually a different industry. A House Energy Committee convened a panel of government witnesses, one of which participated from the Department of Energy. And the congressman asked that gentleman, he said, well, gosh, what's impeding progress? Why can't you get this technical objective met faster? And he said, well, that would require us repealing the first law of thermodynamics. And the congressman looked behind him to his staffer and said, well, gosh, how quickly can we repeal the law of thermodynamics? I will tell you, you need to educate, right? And you need to be up there interacting with folks that really should be able to continue to provide a platform that will enable competition and growth in this industry. don't underestimate the consequences for not doing so. I will leave it at that. I will say, gosh, again, congratulations to all of you on the innovation and the growth that you've enabled. The new entrance into this industry has been outstanding, and really giving college kids a renewed interest in the industry and lessening the barriers to entry for them. So congratulations to all of you, and I look forward to seeing you throughout the rest of the conference. Thank you very much, and look forward to the coffee break. Thank you.